Please. Maybe after the second one.
We just got a quick shot of you guys.
Gentlemen, if we could take a quick photo.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
One more. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Joe McGovern, and I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan and the lead for the one-on-one discussion with Gary Bettman. I'm honored to introduce our guest today, Commissioner Gary Bettman, Commissioner of the National Hockey League. Thank you. Moderating the discussion will be McHugh from NBC Sports. The discussion will run for 45 minutes and will leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so on Twitter using the hashtag AskBettman. Posts with the most mentions will be asked by the moderator, Liam. At this point, I'll turn it over to Liam.
Joe, thanks so much. It's nice to be introduced by a guy from Buffalo, big hockey town. I went to college up in Buffalo.
Very
MIT
nice.
was my safety school, of course.
You also got a graduate degree at Syracuse.
I did. And you are a Cornell grad.
Same part of the woods.
Yeah. And both of us, I'm from Long Island, you're from Queens, and we're going to talk about many different things here today. We're definitely going to talk about the state of the NHL. We're going to talk a little bit about analytics, of course, because that's what this is about. But before that, very exciting time for the NHL. Stretch run, we're getting ready for the playoffs. But this week specifically, it's been a pretty major news week in the NHL. 3 big topics. You look surprised.
I'm trying to remember what the 3 are.
Well, you're a busy guy, but we had, of course, the Centennial announcement, the celebration for that. Expansion was in the news, and
Well, that wasn't supposed to be.
Wasn't supposed to be. Those things tend to happen. And
I've noticed.
also, of course, the news about Patrick Kane. You were on NBCSN with me Wednesday night.
Yes.
You guys had announced that the Patrick Kane investigation that the league had conducted had concluded that the allegations against Patrick Kane, you guys found that they were unfounded, that you would have no further comment, that you were moving on, at which point I asked you to comment.
And we said we'd have no further comment.
Yes.
And you said, oh, I didn't read that far in the release.
No, I got the gist of it. And
okay.
I figured,
So I have nothing to add. I think you've summed it up.
I have summed up, but I'm still going to ask you another question, which I'm just curious. You have Patrick Kane's situation. When you go through something like that, or you go through any other legal matter involving a player in the league, based on what you've gone through, is there now a process set to handle similar events perhaps differently in the future?
So let's be clear. I'm not talking about Patrick Kane in the answer I'm about to give you. Fortunately, our players are terrific, both on and off the ice. When you occasionally have a situation, whether it's alleged criminal activity or anything involving, say, allegations of domestic violence or sexual improprieties, I've always believed that you have to deal with those situations on a case-by-case basis. It's a function of what's being alleged. It's a function of what information's available. And I don't think you can deal with these things on a cookie-cutter basis. In the final analysis, I hope we get it right. As you're going through the intervening steps, there are probably people who are quick to criticize, but I think you've got to determine what information is available to you, evaluate it. And sometimes, particularly when law enforcement's involved, you can't do anything until they're done because they don't want you interfering with their work. So again, I think people associated with sports are held to a high standard. I believe that's appropriate. I don't see anything wrong with that. But how you deal with these situations, you've got to be thorough, you've got to be careful, and I think you've got to be responsive to the particular situation.
Okay. We'll move on. That was on Wednesday, and on that same day, also was the announcement of the Centennial celebration.
Well, we actually announced 3 outdoor games.
Yes.
So we announced the Centennial Classic for January 1st in Toronto at BMO Field between the Red Wings and the Toronto Maple Leafs, who coincidentally will be celebrating their centennial, 100 years. The next day, on January 2nd, we'll be at Busch Stadium in St. Louis, where the Blackhawks will play the Blues in the Winter Classic. Winter Classic, typically when January 1st is on a Sunday, we move it to the legal holiday, which is Monday, so we'll have back-to-back games. We previously announced the game in October, I believe October 20th. Winnipeg, the Edmonton Oilers will be playing the Jets, and the 4th game will be on February 18th in Pittsburgh, the Battle of Pennsylvania between the Flyers and the Penguins in what is their both collectively 50th anniversary year, 50 years of a cross-state rivalry. But all of this is in conjunction with our centennial celebration. The league was founded in 1917 of the 4 majors. I believe that makes us second oldest behind only baseball. And we think with our history and our tradition, it's very important to celebrate 100 years of NHL hockey, 125 years of the Stanley Cup, and 150 years, the Sesquicentennial of Canada.
That was impressive.
Well, you know.
I'm glad you said it.
This is a numbers conference, so I had to get the years right. And so we're going to be doing lots of things that focus on the game and its history, and we intend on being fairly interactive with fans. And while I'm not making any announcements as exactly to what we're going to do, but things like the 100 best this or that, moments, players, these are things that we're going to be doing with fans, with media, with experts on the game.
Who are your top 3 players?
Oh, no, we're not doing that.
No?
No, we're not going to rank them numerically because we don't want anybody's feelings to get hurt.
All right. Well, I'll ask you this, though, because you have 3 in the year 2017, 3
Yes.
outdoor games, 3 rivalry games as well. What goes into choosing these outdoor games?
Well, in 2017, there could be, to tease this ahead, even more outdoor games because our year-long celebration goes January 1st, 2017 through December 31st of 2017, which encompasses parts of 2 seasons. I believe, you know, it's interesting. I think we've had 18 outdoor games, and over 1 million people have attended those 18 games, which is pretty incredible. The most we've had at a game is 105,000 at the University of Michigan for the Winter Classic. I believe it was 2 years ago. Detroit, Toronto. So this game on January 1st next will be a rematch. We try to do 2 things. One, we want to respond to the interest that we get from our clubs and the places that they play. There are some who suggest, oh, there are too many games. If all you do is just watch them on TV, you say, well, okay, you know, the 18th wasn't quite as special, although it was special as the first. But if you go to one of these games, and you've been there, it is incredible. The fan response, the way our fans come together as a community, how they react to being outdoors in such large numbers, in the elements, watching the games. The players love it. It takes the game back to its roots. It's nothing short of phenomenal. I think after we get through the games that we just talked about, that we announced, we will have had 23 of our clubs participate in the outdoor games. But some of it is the local, and some of it is we need to make sure we have decent ratings on NBC when you carry the games. So the matchups tend to be somewhat focused on what a good matchup is on a national television basis, but as importantly, what stadium works. In some cities, you have to play in a baseball stadium. Some cities, you have to play in a football stadium. Football stadium's more complicated for the Winter Classic because that time of year, NFL teams are still playing, might have a playoff games. Baseball stadiums obviously are available, although depending on the stadium, sometimes the sight lines in the baseball stadium isn't quite as good as the bowl configuration in a football
Well,
stadium.
you mentioned the NFL and you mentioned potential conflicts. That's clearly not going to be the case with St. Louis.
Yeah.
When you pick that city, I mean, when you pick that city, does that factor in the fact that the NFL leaves? Is this something that you felt personally that maybe St. Louis needed?
I think that both the owners of the Blues and the Cardinals were really anxious to have this event. I understood why, and we were happy to help.
Fair enough. All right, the third bit of news that was not supposed to be news, but became news.
Oh, so George Larac, the
Yes,
former player,
about expansion.
made an announcement that we had made a decision to exclude a city.
Quebec City.
Well, okay, yeah, but that's not true. We haven't made any decisions. Nothing has changed. He said the Players Association said that. The Players Association swiftly issued a denial. They don't always do that, so I think that's proof positive. But more importantly, we've been in a deliberative process. There's been a lot of speculation about it. We have two applications, one from Quebec City and one from Las Vegas. It was exactly what we expected when we began the process, that those would be the two applications we'd had. And we're doing our due diligence to evaluate what works, what doesn't work, what's good, what's bad of the ownership group, the facility, the market, and what makes sense for the league as a whole.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, what you do have in this league that does not exist currently in other leagues is that you have an imbalance in terms of conferences.
You've noticed.
I have. I
You're very good at math,
counted
too.
all of them
Right,
yesterday.
okay.
So you have 16 teams in the Eastern Conference. You have 14 teams in the Western Conference.
Something we have to focus on.
How much does geography become a factor when?
We're going to have to look at it because if, for example, you're a fan of the Red Wings or the Blue Jackets, you should know your club under no circumstances is moving back to the West. And so one of the factors we're going to have to evaluate is, depending on how the owners want to do expansion, if they want to do it at all, how you deal with alignment. And that's one of the things that we have to talk about.
You're a busy guy. You're here today. You're traveling around a lot. You had dinner at the White House last night.
Name dropper.
Yes. Well, I'm curious, though. Did you have an audience with the president, and is he going to get to an NHL game?
I hope so. I was at the state dinner honoring new Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. It was the first state dinner in honor of Canada at the White House, I think, in 20 years. And it was a great day. There was a greeting ceremony in the morning. There was a luncheon at the State Department at noon, 1 o'clock, and then there was a state dinner. I'd never been to one before, and it's a very special experience. And as part of the evening and the mingling, you go through a receiving line. So I had a brief conversation with the president and the prime minister and their respective spouses. It was an interesting evening.
Washington Capitals right now are
very
the
hot
top team in the NHL. So
by number of points. You know, if I
Yes.
say team's the top team, it gets a little dicey.
well, statistically speaking, I think we could say that they are the top
Well, we
team.
want to be clear about
Yes,
that.
exactly.
In the era of Twitter and shorthanding what people say,
Everyone's polite
we
and
don't
nice
want to
on
get
Twitter.
we don't want to get into trouble.
I think it's interesting. It's not your first time meeting the president.
No, we
Because
typically go to the White House every year with
Stanley
the Stanley
Cup
Cup
award
Right.
to the team. The team obviously gets to go. The Blackhawks were there this year. And I'm reminded of a story of my colleague Keith Jones, who did happen to go to the White House when Bill Clinton was in office. He went with the Colorado Avalanche. He did not win the Stanley Cup with the Colorado Avalanche. He was then traded the next season, but got to go anyway. And as he tells it, President Clinton's shaking all the players' hands. And he says, "Hi, I'm Keith Jones." And the president says, "Well, congratulations, great job." And Keith Jones says, "Thanks, it was all me."
Well, there's a companion story to that because I don't think Bill Clinton was or is much of a hockey fan, although occasionally he shows up at Ranger games living in New York. But this is back, in the mid-'90s. And at that particular White House event, I'll never forget, President Clinton was going through the line of all of the players, and I'm sure of all the people he was meeting and greeting, most of the names weren't familiar to him. And he got to the middle of the team, and Uwe Krupp stuck out his hand and said, "Mr. President, my name's Uwe Krupp, nice to meet you." And President Clinton looked at him, squinted, and said, "You are the first German to get your name on the Stanley Cup," which kind of blew away everybody.
So that idea that he makes you feel like he's having a one-on-one conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the rumors are true.
Yes.
So, you've been the commissioner since 1993.
Yes?
So when we start talking about the advances in the game, we talk about technological advances and the advances in analytics and statistics. How drastically different are things for you from the beginning until now?
Well, putting aside for a moment analytics and statistics, think about what our world was our world meaning the NHL's, or even the general world in February of 1993. Email was starting to catch on, but you were using a desktop to do it. We didn't have an over-the-air television presence on a network nationally in the United States. There was no NHL.com. There was no streaming out-of-market packages. It was, if you wanted scores of an out-of-town game, you had to call sports phone to get them. I mean, if we had to discipline a player for something that happened in the game, typically, if the game was being televised, somebody had to FedEx a cassette to us, which we'd get a day or two later. What has transpired because of technological advances and the digital platforms is twofold. It's enabled us to function better as a league. We can do everything now in real time. We have a situation room in Toronto that is watching every game in real time and is capable of communicating into the arena with the officials if necessary during a game. So if there's an injury or the lights go out or something's wrong with the ice, technology.
Yeah.
Ooh. Are we okay? No? There's a little bit of feedback. Can we fix this? Hello? Well, whatever. NBC doesn't do it.
No, you'd get color bars, and we'd be back after this. And then we would apologize to the country.
Can we fix this? Hello? Working on it?
Okay.
Should we just try yelling? And
We can do that. Can you project?
you'll tell me. This.
All right, well, we'll continue while they try to fix it. What would you say?
Somebody's running in our direction?
This is why you come and see the show live.
It's delaying. It started all of a sudden. Okay, but
Regardless. What would you say the hardest part of your job is now, and what was it back when you took over?
doing interviews where you hear yourself
Right at this
coming
moment?
back. I've always hated double enders, and this is why. The hardest part of the job was trying to find more and more ways to connect with our fans. It's a follow-up to the question I was answering about the changes, because the biggest change is not only our ability to interact with the game on an immediate basis, but more importantly, our fans can connect with the game and get more content, more information in ways that nobody ever imagined.
I could say, you mentioned Twitter before, and I can almost guarantee that the picture of Gary Bettman doing this will be on Twitter shortly. So we all have that.
Thank you for that suggestion.
Well, I just putting it out there.
Next time you do something silly on the air, we're going to have to do that.
Just
But
tune in nightly.
I don't know if you can hear it out there, but this is incredibly annoying up here.
It's a little difficult.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
But then again, I mean, with my job, I'm used to standing next to Mike Milbury, so this is This is nice and relaxed. There's really no threat of violence at any moment, so.
But be careful. He's a hometown favorite.
I know. This will get back to him somehow.
Understood.
Let's dig in a little bit more to analytics. And I'm curious, over the last few years, how has the attitude changed throughout the league in terms of embracing advanced statistics?
To the extent there's more information available, our clubs that are extraordinarily competitive want to do everything possible to get an edge. I don't think you can win your games on paper, and the importance of chemistry and building a team the right way is something that will require human analysis and intuition. But the statistics give you a sense as to whether or not you're trending in the right direction, you're doing the right things. You know, our competitive balance is so extraordinary. Last year, I think we're getting better. Last year, we had 7 teams that made the playoffs that didn't the year before. If the playoffs started today, I believe there'd be 6 teams that weren't in the playoffs last year that are in this year. So our teams are constantly looking for whatever information will give them an edge.
Haven't had a repeat Stanley Cup champion since the late 90s with the Red Wings.
Exactly.
I mean, stats play into that, but what else do you attribute that competitive balance and that parity to?
The economic system that we have. We paid a high price to get it, but the fact of the matter is we have a system where all teams can afford to compete, and as a result, we probably have the best competitive balance in our history and the best competitive balance in all sports, because we will go down to the wire to determine playoff matchups. We got, oh, great.
There we go.
Yes, thank you.
Leave them on. Just mute them on.
Hello?
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 Check. Check, check.
This
Hello?
is better. Doesn't
This
work
is.
at all. Can you hear us? You know?
All right.
Well, now it's on. And that, you know, there was a difference. For a while, they had me convinced I was going crazy. Okay, that I was in an echo world. This is much better, although I am dizzy. But go ahead.
It's a new challenge every day, and we're
But this is
embracing it here.
much better. Thank you, guys.
I also wanted to get into, you have a relationship now with Major League Baseball.
Yes, we do.
And-
With BAM.
And let's face it, baseball is clearly a sport that's embraced analytics and definitely embraced advanced statistics. What are you looking to get out of the relationship right now?
Well, actually, BAM and BAM Tech, and I think most people know this, is perhaps the preeminent platform for streaming live baseball games and now hockey games and lots of other programming, particularly sports. We were coming off a long-term relationship, and when we started that relationship, I think NHL.com at that point, at the beginning, was perceived to be, if not the best, one of the best sports sites in all of sports. But I think over time, for a variety of reasons, we didn't quite have the same edge, and I was analyzing what we should do to either change how that relationship was performing or consider another partner. And what happened in the final analysis was I was confronted with a decision as to whether or not we might want to do it ourselves or to use one of the other partnerships with a third party that was available. And I concluded that if I spent lots and lots of money, tens of millions of dollars, and spent 1.5 years to 2 years, if we got it right, we would be as good as BAM. And on that basis, we started talking to BAM even more seriously. And then we talked about really coming together as partners on programming, aggregating programming in the digital space. You know, some would say not all that different than what ESPN did 40 years ago, aggregating content on cable platforms. And we decided to come together, and over time you will see, I think, an evolution of how we program, and it's not inconceivable that you will see, you know, the ability to buy year-round programming the way you do either from satellite or cable. but going on a streaming platform instead. I like the way they approach streaming and the coverage of the game. They're also running the NHL Network for us as well, and for those of you who have seen it, they've made extraordinary efforts. And everything they've done has been incredible in record time because we only concluded the handshake over the summer. They got the NHL Network up and running in their studios on October 1st, I think it was, or at least for the start of the season in October. And a month ago, in what could only be characterized as a high wire act, we actually switched platforms in the middle of the season. And I would say while it wasn't perfect, it was about as close to perfect as you could do with that kind of undertaking. And we're looking to do more and more things together, including with our partners at SAP, aggregating more kinds of statistics, creating more kinds of filters, and even considering things like puck and player tracking, which will have a whole host of uses, whether it's for teams collecting more information for competitive reasons, whether or not it's broadcasters having more information to tell stories, or whether or not it's for our fans being able to look inside of a game that's incredibly fast and break it down into components that they're interested in.
So much of collecting that information then leads to trying to figure out exactly how to use that information. And one of the cool things about being here and when we were back in the green room is just seeing the people who are walking through, and you see Jeff Van Gundy going through and Shane Battier, but then we also ran into Michael Lewis as well.
Yes.
So that leads us to his writings in Moneyball and Billy Beane and the Oakland A's. Do you foresee an NHL franchise being that type of a franchise like the A's are, where you have that strong relationship with numbers where it dictates in many ways the flow of how you bring players in?
I think our teams, our managers, coaches covet, crave as much information as they can get. But again, I think, you don't play these games on paper. And there's a human element, there's an emotional element, there's a chemistry. Our game in particular has ebbs and flows of momentum. And while I think you can make yourself better, I think the data can point you in the right direction. But I think a really good general manager has to have a feel for the game, for the locker room, the players on his team, and how they interact. Because no matter what the statistics are, particularly in hockey, if the guys in the room don't like and respect each other, they're not going to win.
You mentioned just before the possibility of having technology that could track players and show different things that would be useful for the fans, but also useful for the teams themselves.
And the puck, too.
I'm curious, though, player safety is such a big issue, especially in the NHL. Are you looking into technology, chips and helmets perhaps, that can tell us a little bit more about head injuries?
Well, two things. One, we take player safety extraordinarily seriously. It's important to us, and it's something that we do with the Players Association. And since 1997, when we were the first sports league to undertake the study of concussions with the Players Association, with the medical people, trainers, and physicians, we've looked to innovate, whether or not it was because we were the first sports league to do baseline testing, first sports league to have protocols for diagnosis and return to play decisions, rule changes, and the like. But you've got to understand what you're doing and making sure you're not going off on tangents that don't make sense. So, for example, helmets, first and foremost, tend to protect you against cracking your skull. What happens in a concussion happens inside the head, and technology, I'm not sure, has been able to tell us exactly what we need to know, which is why I think doctors have learned more and more about concussions, and we all have gotten more conservative as to how they're diagnosed, which is why we have a quiet room, and when certain visible signs happen on the ice, the players removed from play and evaluated.
For those who've never been into the quiet, what exactly is the quiet room?
The quiet room is where either a trainer or a doctor supervises an evaluation of the player, looking at symptoms and using a test called the SCAT-3 to see how well oriented the player is.
What is it actually like? I'm just curious.
Well, it's a series of physical and mental evaluations.
No, what exactly is the quiet room? Because, I mean, it's got this title, and I think you imagine that it is
because
this...
you can't do this on the bench
Well, I'm
with
aware of that.
20,000 people. Do they
it-
go to a room and close the door? So it's quiet.
And we just decided it's the quiet
It's
room?
really not that complicated.
Fair enough. Well, let's get back to player safety. Because I am curious, as you take into account player safety, you have to take into account fighting.
Yes.
And obviously concussions are directly tied because you have two guys dropping the gloves. And this is still a sport where, let's face it, no other North American professional sport that isn't a combat sport where fighting is still allowed. You get penalized for it, but you do
What do
not...
you mean allowed? It's penalized.
You get penalized,
Okay.
but it's not an automatic suspension, let's put it that way.
Okay.
We're seeing the frequency of fighting decrease.
It's at a record low, I believe.
It is. At what point do you see it eventually being phased out?
As I've constantly said, is the way the game is played evolves by the people who are playing it and coaching it and managing it. And what I think has happened is over time, most teams have concluded that because the game is so competitive, that they want 4 lines of players who can play, that are skillful, and they're not looking for the specialty players anymore who have perhaps one, quote, skill. And I think teams have gotten more concerned with good defense and scoring goals than anything else. I also believe that perhaps the fact that visors are now mandatory, subject to grandfathering, may have had an impact as well. But you watch tons of games in your capacity. You hardly see the stage fighting anymore, if at all. And it's an emotional game. And let's not lose sight of the fact that you have very good sized, well put together physical players in a sport where they're moving around at 30 miles an hour. Body checking's encouraged, and oh, by the way, they're carrying sticks. There is a school of thought that the occasional fight is a thermostat on the way the game is played.
But the argument could be made that in the NFL, you have very large, very physical players. And let's face it, if you go over the middle in the NFL and you get lit up by a defender where it's maybe a borderline hit, someone else doesn't rush in, drop the gloves, and everyone watches as they throw down.
Because
what's the purpose?
Well, it's the difference that you play for 5 or 6 seconds in the NFL, and then you take off 45 seconds and everybody cools down and chills out. We are virtually nonstop, constant, emotional, edgy, and that's part of what makes the game great. And I think you can't compare on a whole host of levels football and hockey. Not saying one's better or worse than the other. They are just different, and I don't think you can give it a blanket stereotype and try and compare them. And actually, I made the analogy I just said once at a conference like this, and there was a former football player who's pretty prominent. He goes, I never thought about it that way, and you're absolutely right.
What would your message be to a young hockey player who thinks, I'm going to make the NHL by using my fists?
I would think he should focus on stick handling and skating, because that's where the future of the game is and is going.
Does that mean that you eventually do foresee?
How many of the so-called fighters are now in the minor leagues? You watch the games, as everybody does. That's fighting's at its lowest point. It doesn't appear to be a growth profession.
Well, I'm just amazed that attitudes have changed, because let's face it, I work with Mike Milbury. Here's a guy who clearly embraced fighting for a very, very long time, whether it was on the ice or potentially in the stands with another person's shoe.
And now you're telling me he found religion.
Exactly. Now
Okay.
he has a little bit more information. He's concerned about safety, but at the same time, it's tough to change what's inside, which is, I think when you see two guys who are willing combatants in certain situations drop the gloves, there is a natural rush of adrenaline, of energy,
And it takes
Do you,
down.
I'm
And it
just
takes down the
personally,
temperature.
how do you feel when you're at a game?
I'm much more analytical when I watch the game. I'm watching it for a whole host of other things, including what the officials are doing, where they're standing, whether or not they have the game under control, how the game got to where it is. It's not. I like to watch a good play, but that's not what I focus on when I'm watching the game.
You did mention we are seeing a lot of fires in the minor league level. We're not seeing them at the NHL level. And we have seen some incidents.
Because it evolves, and it will continue to evolve one way or the other.
Yeah, and we've seen some incidents at the minor league level and at lower levels. We've seen fights involving referees as well. We've seen recently a player get handcuffed and taken off the ice. You're the top level.
And
Is
by
there
the
a
way,
message to be sent?
I think the message is clear, because as we've been saying throughout this discussion, fighting is at its lowest level. And I think and it goes to your question, if you're a young player, you better focus on being a skilled player. You want to be a fast skater. You want to have soft hands to handle the puck. That's where your future is going to be if you want to have any hope or aspiration of playing at the NHL level.
A lot of changes in the league in terms of rules. This year, we've had Coach's Challenge.
Yes.
Coach's Challenge, we have it for goalie interference. We have it for offsides. What's your evaluation so far of that, and do you see it progressing to other areas?
I don't think you can officiate a game, particularly one as fast as ours, off the ice with constant video replay. You get one chance to be wrong on the Coach's Challenge. There have been recently a couple of coaches complaining about the Coach's Challenge because they think the call is inconsistent. Unlike our typical video replay on whether or not there's a goal, was it a high stick, the puck crossed the line, things of that nature, our guys in Toronto in the Situation Room, as distinguished from the quiet room, our guys have probably 8,000 reviews a season, and they don't get 5 wrong because it's crystal clear as to whether or not the puck's over the line. For example, when we decided to go to a Coach's Challenge, we said, listen, even though every sports league studies what we've done and has, to some extent, emulated or imitated it, when it comes to the goaltender interference call, it is a judgment call. We are not going to give you the same level of precision. In fact, we call it something different. When the officials get to look at it again, and in that case, it's the officials making the call, not the guys in Toronto, the view is, by looking at a replay, the official make a better call? Was the goaltender poked with the stick at the last second and nobody saw it because it happened in a split second? Or was an offensive player called for goaltender interference when in fact he never touched the goalie, it was his own man? It was really intended for that egregious situation, of which we think there are typically 20 a year. I think the coaches some of them, lose sight of that and overuse it, saying, well, I thought that was goaltender interference. You know, the NFL doesn't use replay for pass interference. It's a judgment call. It should only be used when it was clearly erroneous. And I think we have a general managers meeting next week, and we'll spend a little time reviewing exactly what the expectation should have been and what we promised last year.
You do mention, though, for certain situations, the officials on the ice
Yes.
look at review, and they're looking at essentially like a tablet.
Yeah.
Now, you have the Situation Room and you have the video room. Is it better off with having officials in a loud arena with just a tablet or are they in conjunction with
They're talking to each other. They're in conjunction, but because it's a judgment call, we defer to their judgment. And also, keep in mind, they had been calling the game a certain way throughout the game. And if you want some consistency, what you're doing is saying, here's another look at it. Do you think you can make a better call than the one you made? That's all you can promise on a judgment call.
Also this season, 3-on-3 overtime was
Yes.
introduced.
We're running at a decision rate at about 60%, which is up over 44% for 4-on-4,
Yeah.
doing exactly what we expected.
So obviously far less shootouts, games are being decided in overtime. You do hear the occasional gripe about it in terms of a player or a coach that it's not real hockey. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's fast-paced. I'm just wondering, when you hear those complaints, what's your response? And I'm wondering if those
Shut up.
coaches,
Don't
well, I'm wondering if
complain.
those coaches
Why
and
would
those
you
players,
demean your own
would
product?
would they rather have the shootout settle?
No, you know, well, on some level, there are some people who say just play till the end of every game, but that's not realistic in the regular season, where we've got we're playing 82 games in 184 days, and we've got to get people in the air into the next city. So that doesn't work. What we really focus on is the fact that overwhelmingly the players and coaches like it. Early on, there were a couple of teams that were losing lots of them, and the players complained that it was either too exhausting, and it was a very small handful, or there are a couple of coaches that have complained. But overwhelmingly, it's been positively received, and particularly look at what we did at the All-Star game, and everybody said, wow, that's the best All-Star innovation that any league's come up with maybe ever, because it was fun, it was entertaining, and it was competitive.
It completely changed the dynamic of the All-Star game.
Absolutely. The $1 million didn't hurt either.
No.
But the game was more entertaining than I think any All-Star game than anybody's seen in a very long time.
No, and I think the key word there was that you got an All-Star game that was actually competitive.
Absolutely.
Where players really cared. Is this going to be the format going forward for the All-Star?
I think so. We may tinker with it a little bit. Maybe we'll move it in. I'm now hyperventilating. I don't have anybody's agreement on it. Maybe we move the divisional elements into the skills competition as well. We always try to self-evaluate everything we're doing. We don't just say this was great and move on. We're constantly, whether it's the game on the ice on a daily basis or big events, we're always looking what we could do to innovate and improve.
Clearly, the big story of the All-Star weekend became John Scott. And
they're going to make a movie, I heard.
They did. And, well, we had what amounted to pretty much a Hollywood ending. You had the unlikely All-Star, who was the unlikeliest of All-Star captains, who became clearly the unlikeliest of All-Star MVPs in the history of the league. But when you have a Hollywood ending, it usually means that you have several obstacles and bumps along the way. I'm curious, because of that and because of the way he was selected for the game, is the NHL looking to change the way players are voted into the All-Star game?
We're evaluating it. I don't know whether or not we're going to make a change. Clearly, we responded to fans telling us what they wanted with the campaign. It was fun. It was interesting to have John Scott there. And I know there was a lot chronicled as to what was discussed and what wasn't, a lot of it not accurate. But in the final analysis, we were happy to have him here because he wanted to be there. And a lot of people took that for granted initially because he had a decision to make as to whether or not, under the circumstances, he wanted to be there. But once he decided he wanted to be there, there was never an issue. He was welcomed with open arms, and he helped make what in Nashville was a spectacular All-Star weekend.
Who's going to play you in the movie?
I don't know. Hopefully nobody.
I have a feeling you're going to have some role in that movie when it eventually...
Well, I'm not going to play myself. I promise you that.
Fair enough. So as we get set now, because I think Sunday marks about 4 weeks into the end of the regular season. Wednesday would be about 4 weeks until the start of the playoffs.
We've played over 1,000 games in our 1,230 game regular season. So I think we have a couple of hundred games left.
We're hitting that moment now where teams are positioning themselves for the postseason and changed the playoff format a little bit in terms of division realignment a few years ago, where you have your division winners as your top seeds, you have wild cards, and you're essentially getting, especially in 2-3 games in the division, you're getting rivalry games. Is that a format that you see being the long-term format for this league?
It's worked extraordinarily well. The feedback...
You worried about repetition at all in terms of same teams playing?
On the one hand, we talk about rivalries, and then you say repetition like it's a bad thing. Rivalries that last into the regular season really get developed in an intense playoff series. And so the format we have is off to a great start. I haven't heard really any complaints about it. And it's made for exciting, unpredictable playoffs.
I mean, you mentioned rivalries, and I think if the playoffs started today, you'd have Islanders-Rangers, you'd have Washington versus Pittsburgh, you'd have the two Florida teams playing each other.
I think we'd have two California teams.
And you would definitely have two California teams playing in the first round as well. There was, speaking with Darren Drager a few weeks back, and he mentioned that people have floated the idea of expanding the playoffs or possibly having play-in games. At this point, you're having 8 of the 16 teams make it in one conference, 8 of the 14 teams make it in the other. Is there any way that you see more teams making it or having play-in games?
You know, no. To me, a play-in game doesn't make sense because the team with the better record getting knocked out in one game is probably not their idea of a good time. I think what we have to listen. One of the great things about our game is everybody's associated with it, whether it's managers or coaches or players or the media. People are always talking about, what can we do? What about this? What about that? And we're going to be 100 years old. We don't need to radicalize what is a great game, which is probably from an entertainment, speed, skill, competitive standpoint, has never been better. Doesn't mean we don't keep monitoring and we don't look to make adjustments where necessary, but the fundamentals are pretty good.
As we look ahead to the postseason right now, it would mean that no team from Canada would make it into the postseason. It would be the first time, I believe, since 1970. Back then, there were only 2 Canadian clubs. Yeah. What does that mean for the league? How does that affect the league? Is it bad for the NHL?
Well, we're one league. We're not a Canadian league and we're not a U.S. league. And half of our players come from Canada. If you're Rogers, you may be a little, less than thrilled. But these things go through cycles. There's no conspiracy. It happens. The Canadians got off to a spectacular start, and then the wheels fell off. People had higher expectations for a couple of the other teams. Toronto's in a rebuild and really going about it in the right way. I don't think when you're dealing with any sport or any team, particularly a league that's almost 100 years old, you take a snapshot. You have to be a little patient, and you have to watch the movie play out.
The Flames were one of those teams that made the playoffs last year. Clearly, it looks like they are not going to make the playoffs this year. In fact, the biggest news involving the Calgary Flames was the news with Dennis Wideman. So Wideman, for those who don't know, he checks an official on the ice on his way to the bench after being checked himself. Now, when I was talking to people leading up to the suspension news, I was hearing 10 games, possibly 15 games. You came out 20-game suspension. Why was 20 games so important for this situation?
Well, I'm going to have to duck a little bit on this. Let me give you the process, but not the punchline. Hockey operations, Coley Campbell, decided that this should be a 20-game suspension, although it wasn't called on the ice as an abusive official suspension. Could have been if somebody had seen it, but it was away from the play. I believe he used that as a guide that 20 games for this category was the right thing. There's then, under the collective bargaining agreement, the possibility of an appeal to me. I affirmed it. And for the first time in this CBA, we provided that if a suspension was for more than 6 games, provided we agreed because it was important to the players, it could be appealed to a neutral under a limited standard. We're now in the process where we've submitted everything. We had 2 days of hearings. We've submitted briefs. And the neutral arbitrator has to render a decision. So I don't want to comment on the substance of it because somebody might tweet it out. He might read it. I don't want to affect the decision.
Fair enough. And that's the new process that's in place. I think the Flames play tonight. And if that's the case,
This will be the 20th
this
game.
will be the 20th game while the appeal process is still going on. So the only thing he can hope to recoup is money.
Correct.
Is that a process that needs to be tinkered with?
No, I think the process is we suspend players for a whole host of reasons precisely when the event takes place moving forward. You have a serious incident, you need an in-person hearing, you're suspended pending the hearing. I think that's the most important thing we can do. This dragged out for a whole host of reasons which may not have been necessary, but I am perfectly comfortable with the process. And this is, while we've said my decisions under certain circumstances could be subject to appeal, this process is something that was very important to us and also part of the negotiations.
How important at this point is to get the message out about the safety of officials and protecting officials?
Again, I don't want to do anything that may influence what the arbitrator has to do. I'm happy to have this conversation with you after we get a decision.
Fair enough. we mentioned all these Canadian clubs, and we're talking about teams not making the playoffs. So while some teams are in the stretch run positioning for playoffs, you have other teams that are potentially positioning themselves for the draft lottery. And last year, the word tanking came up quite a bit. And listen, I know it's a word that no commissioner wants to hear. And I don't believe personally that any player that took the ice was looking to lose a game or any coach that was coaching was looking to lose a game. Good. However, I would say that you put together a team that potentially may not go out and win a lot of games because you're looking for the future.
Sometimes you have to do that. I don't think.
But we've changed the draft lottery.
Yes, we have to
and
make it harder to win it.
If you were dead last in the league, you weren't going to finish any worse than second in the lottery.
Well, now you can drop down.
And that was big because you had two main prizes at the top of that draft. We've changed it now.
Yes.
And you moved down. Are you satisfied that this is something that'll curb the idea, or at least curb the notion in people's minds that teams are tanking?
I don't think the notion's there. I think some people speculate about it. I think it tends to be commentary on some people covering the game. If you talk to our players and you talk to our coaches and you talk to our managers, they don't tank. It's not in their vocabulary. It's not consistent with being the professionals that they are. Yes, there's speculation, but if you're a team that has been chronically not so good and you're not going to make the playoffs, you need to rebuild. And rebuilding is a fact of life for teams in sports.
Edmonton's been that team.
They've been very lucky.
Yes, very lucky. This is a team they are stockpiling #1 draft picks, but it hasn't paid off at this point. And I believe they have 11 first-round picks and they have 4 #1 overall picks, and they're in a position to potentially get a #1 pick this year. Do you think there's any way that there should be a limit in how many years in a row a team can get a #1 pick?
It's something that people have suggested we should talk about. I haven't reached a conclusion. Let's see how it works this year in the first year of the new format before we all get too hyper on the subject.
Fair enough. And we'll see, at this point, I think it's Toronto that's in line. And we have the potential of an American going #1 in the NHL draft, Austin Matthews. Pretty interesting.
Not just an American, somebody from Arizona,
yes,
who I believe has said that when he was 3 or 4 years old, somebody took him to a Coyotes game and he got hooked. Talk about, expansion into the Sun Belt and what it's meant. There's also a highly rated defenseman whose name's escaping right now, who's likely to go fairly high in the first round from Boca Raton, Florida. You remember his name? I can't remember.
I don't remember. I will.
What?
Chychrun. Yeah, Chychrun.
That's right. Thank you, Frank.
And we have a couple of European players who are expected to be in the top 3. It's a global game, and I think you look at Austin Matthews' journey, this is a guy who grew up in the desert Southwest, but kind of taking a non-traditional route into the NHL. He's playing professionally
in Switzerland.
In Switzerland. What's the NHL stance on how guys enter the league and what their journey is to the NHL?
We've actually convened a series of meetings with the hockey world, the European leagues, the colleges, major junior, the USHL, the AHL, because if you were to look at football or basketball, there's a pretty vertical route to the highest level. If you look at us, it's a spider web of alternative ways to do it. And we've actually, and Pat LaFontaine has been spearheading this, been talking about maybe there's a better, more efficient system that's more predictable for young prospects. That's something we're looking at. But, we have kids come in from major junior, from U.S. colleges, from Canadian colleges, from Europe. It's all over the place. And I can't say that there's any right or wrong way that leads to the development of a player, but there may be a more efficient way. And frankly, when a child is in his mid-teens, giving a little more certainty if this is his dream and mission as to how to go about it is probably a good thing for young developing teenagers.
Just over 5 minutes remaining before we open it up for questions. Mike Milbury wanted me to ask you a question.
Did he text it in? Or
he texted to me earlier. I've edited out all the profanity. I thought that was probably best.
You'll give people the wrong idea.
He's curious. He's a big fan, as you know, of 3-on-3 overtime.
Yes.
He loves it. I think he was hooked instantly the first time he saw it. He's wondering since
That makes me want to reconsider.
yeah. But since it's been so successful, and I think since the fans have really supported it the way they have, do you see any situation where an NHL playoff game
No.
would go to 4-on-4 or 3-on-3?
No.
Not even in a non-clinching situation?
No.
Never.
No. One of the great things about our game is the way our playoff games play out. And during every playoff game, we roughly average high 80s, 90 playoff games. You get 2 or 3 of those marathon games, they become legendary. No, I don't see any movement in that direction. Just like I don't see any movement towards moving the shootout into the playoffs. Even though I think if you could win the gold medal in the Olympics in a shootout, we've seen it happen. I think.
And you can make the playoffs based on
Yes, but
being
that's different.
successful.
Okay, but that's the way we play the regular season. And if it comes down to the wire, as it did a few seasons ago between the Rangers and Philadelphia, so be it.
Jeremy Roenick did not send me a question, but I just assume that Jeremy Roenick's question is, when are you getting a hockey team in Las Vegas, and can he be the league's ambassador to Las Vegas?
I don't know if that would be more dangerous for us or for him. As I know we touched on expansion before, we're in the process of evaluating the 2 expansion applications we have. And I can't sit here today and predict with any certainty whether or not we'll expand at all, or by 1 or by 2 teams. And so that's something that's going to have to play out. It's ultimately the owner's decision. The executive committee of the league is a group of 10 owners that's currently in the process of going through that evaluation.
I mentioned that you took this job in 1993. Not long ago, you signed a contract extension, which will go on for another few years.
Bunch of years, yeah.
How long do you see yourself doing this job?
The answer is, and I've consistently give this answer, you would ask me what year the contract expires. I'm not exactly sure because I don't focus on that. I love what I do. You need a certain amount, like complete energy and passion to do this. And if any point I don't feel the energy or the passion, then I've got to stop. But, I've been doing it for 23 years. I started this as a kid. I guess I've aged a little bit. But in the final analysis, I love what I do. And I feel not only excited, but energized by the opportunities. And if that ever changes, then I'll have to reevaluate. Hasn't changed in 23 years. In fact, it's gotten more and more intense. In the final analysis, though, I serve at the will of the owners. They're the ones who appoint me, who deal with my contract. And if at any point they're not happy, then they'll send somebody to have a conversation with me. But that hasn't been the case.
And the final one for me, when you started off 23 years ago, you have certain goals. Are there any goals still from back then that you still feel like you really want to accomplish in the job?
There are so many opportunities. I wanted and still want to bring the game, I think it's the greatest game with the greatest athletes in the world, to more people more of the time. And it's a journey to do that. We're available in more places and in more ways than ever before. We have more fans than we've ever had. When I took over, I want to say the average attendance was 14,000 people a game, and we were drawing 14 million fans. We've been doing 21 million. We're averaging 17 or 18,000 fans a game. We're on, for the first time in our history under our current deal with NBC, and this may sound ridiculous, but it was one of the things I inherited. For the first time under this NBC deal, every playoff game is on national TV. We never had that. So we are more available. We're on more platforms. There's more ways for fans to interact with us than ever before. And we're a worldwide game. I think there's a ton more we can do to continue the growth of this game at all levels.
Well, we're just about out of time. When we started this, we were thinking about how long 45 minutes was. And I said, I think it's about 43 minutes longer than the average TV interview lasts. So we were a little bit worried, but
you did very well. You kept up. Your stamina was fine.
So we're going to open it up for questions from Twitter. And I think they're coming in
fast and furious.
Let's see what we got here. Okay.
See, this is really high tech. In the old days, there'd be a mic in the aisle, and somebody would have to get up and decide whether or not they wanted to embarrass themselves or not. This is anonymous, and anything there?
It's much easier this way. All right. Well, you were talking about Europe and talking about growing the game and talking about Austin Matthews playing in Europe. Question here is there any interest long-term in expansion, potentially into Europe? And would you go with trial games there before that?
Okay, so let's
We've
take,
had a few.
Let's take a step back. We've had exhibition games outside of North America. We've had regular season games. We typically do our non-North American events outside North America with the Players Association, whether it's the Olympics or the World Cup. World Cup is coming back next September in Toronto. 8 teams, 6 countries, and then a composite team of Europeans and an under-24 team of North Americans, and it's going to be a great 2-week tournament, maybe the best international tournament that's ever been played. We brought back the World Cup because we were finally in a position to work with the Players Association internationally. There was a rough period there in terms of our collective bargaining relationship, and then some uncertainty in the Players Association from a leadership standpoint. But since Don Fear's been leading the union's had a focus, and we've been able to work together, and that's been terrific. World Cup. We're going to use the World Cup to reestablish our international presence. Exhibition games, clinics, regular season games, and the like. Do I see expansion? There are a whole host of reasons why at least for the foreseeable future, it's not on the radar screen. One, obviously travel. Two, there are leagues already in place in important countries like Finland and Sweden and Switzerland, and they're not anxious to give up their prominence in those countries, and I understand that. And the infrastructure and the economics of playing the game in Europe, nature of the arenas and the like, although that's changing, isn't quite at our level yet. So I think while we want to continue to have our international presence because we are the most international of the 4 major sports leagues, and 25% of our players come from outside of North America, we want to continue to encourage interest in the game, but franchises on terra firma, I don't see for the foreseeable future.
Time for one more? One more, okay. So someone would like to know how the instability of the Canadian dollar could impact the salary cap going forward.
Well, the fluctuation, I'm not sure I buy instability, the fluctuation is something that our system partially accounts for. There is a hedge because we compute revenue sharing, the salary caps, the escrows determined by doing everything in US dollars. So if the Canadian dollar rises, there's more US dollars in the computation, and if it falls, there's less. The Canadian clubs are no strangers to the fluctuations. Actually, I think when I took over 23 years ago, the Canadian dollar was somewhere in the 60s. It's a fact of life, and everybody's dealing with it.
Is that it? Is that all the time we have? Well, see, it flew by. I told you,
Thank you.
fastest 45 minutes of your life right here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.